American English versus British English. Use of present perfect tense. American English. I lost my key. Can you help me look for it? British English. I've lost my key. Can you help me look for it? In American English. I lost my key. Can you help me look for it? In this sentence, the simple past tense, lost, is used to describe a past action or event. The speaker is emphasizing the action of losing the key as a past event without a strong connection to the present moment. It's more straightforward and factual, as if the speaker is reporting what happened. In British English. I've lost my key. Can you help me look for it? In this sentence, the present perfect tense, I've lost, is used. The present perfect tense is often used to emphasize the connection between the past action and the present moment. It suggests that the action of losing the key has relevance or importance in the present. The speaker is not only stating the fact that the key is lost, but also implying that this loss has some impact on their current situation, or that it's something they are currently dealing with. So, while the core meaning of the sentences is the same, the use of the present perfect tense in British English adds a subtle layer of emphasis on the present consequences or relevance of the past action, making it feel more immediate or personal compared to the simple past tense used in American English. How to use the words already, just, and yet in American and British English. In American English, I just had lunch. Or, I've just had lunch. In British English, I've just had lunch. In American English, did you finish your homework yet? In British English, have you finished your homework yet? The words already, just, and yet can be used differently in American and British English, especially when it comes to verb tenses and sentence structure. Let's examine the differences in these sentences. American English. I just had lunch. Did you finish your homework yet? British English. I've just had lunch. Have you finished your homework yet? Just, in American and British English. In both American and British English, just is used to indicate a very recent action. However, the difference lies in the verb tense. In American English, the simple past tense, I just had lunch, is commonly used to describe an action that occurred very recently. The emphasis is on the past action. And the present perfect tense is not typically used for this context. In British English, the present perfect tense, I've just had lunch, is more commonly used to convey the same meaning. The present perfect tense suggests a connection between the recent action, having lunch, and the present moment, emphasizing the immediacy of the action's relevance to the present. Yet, in American and British English, yet is used to inquire whether something has happened or to express the idea of up to this time or up to now. In American English, the past tense question, did you finish your homework yet, is common. It asks if the action of finishing homework has occurred at any point in the past leading up to the present, with the emphasis on the past completion or non-completion of the task. In British English, the present perfect tense question, have you finished your homework yet, is more commonly used. It asks about the completion of the homework up to the present moment, emphasizing the connection between the past action, finishing homework, and the present. In essence, the main difference between American and British English regarding the use of already, just, and yet is the preference for verb tenses. American English tends to use the simple past tense more often, while British English favors the present perfect tense for actions that have a connection to the present moment. Possession in both American and British English. In American English, have. She has a beautiful new home. Do you have a car? In British English, have got. She's got a beautiful new home. Have you got a car? The difference in how possession is expressed in American English and British English primarily centers around the use of the verb have and the phrase have got. While both forms are grammatically correct, they are used with varying frequency and nuances in each variant of English. Have. In American English, the verb have is commonly used to express possession. For example, she has a beautiful new home. Do you have a car? Have for possession versus have for auxiliary verbs. American English tends to use have primarily for possession. When it comes to auxiliary verbs, such as forming the present perfect tense, I have eaten, or expressing obligation, I have to go, Americans generally don't use have got. Have got. In British English, while the verb have can also be used to indicate possession, it's more common to use the phrase have got for this purpose. She's got a beautiful new home. Have you got a car? Have for possession versus have for auxiliary verbs. British English employs have got for possession, but it also uses have in other contexts, including auxiliary verbs like forming the present perfect tense, I have eaten, and expressing obligation, I have to go. However, the preference for have got when referring to possession is more pronounced in British English. In conclusion, both American and British English speakers can understand both forms, but they tend to favor one over the other in different contexts. Americans typically use have for possession and may use have in auxiliary verb constructions, while the British more frequently use have got for possession but still use have for auxiliary verbs. The choice between the two forms often depends on regional and personal preferences. The verb get is used slightly differently in American English and British English, particularly when it comes to the past participle form. Here's a breakdown of the differences. Past participle gotten. In American English, the past participle of get is often gotten. For example, he has gotten 3 days off. I had gotten a new job. Usage of gotten in passive voice. American English frequently uses gotten in passive voice constructions, such as the example, he is gotten 3 days off. This usage emphasizes the result of an action or the state achieved. Past participle got. In British English, the past participle of get is typically got. For example, he has got 3 days off. I had got a new job. Usage of got in passive voice. British English generally uses got in passive voice constructions similar to American English. So, in British English, you might also say, he is got 3 days off. In conclusion, the primary difference between American and British English regarding the verb get is the past participle form. Americans often use gotten, while the British prefer got. However, both varieties of English use got in passive voice constructions, especially when emphasizing the result of an action or a state achieved. The choice of gotten or got may also depend on regional and personal preferences, but these distinctions are generally consistent in formal writing and speech for each variant. American English and British English have several vocabulary differences due to historical, cultural, and regional factors. Here are some examples of vocabulary variations between the two. Color, American English versus color, British English. This is a classic example of spelling differences. Americans tend to drop the U in words like color, favor, and neighbor, whereas the British include the U as in color, favor, and neighbor. Fall, American English versus autumn, British English. While both words refer to the season between summer and winter, fall is commonly used in American English, while autumn is more prevalent in British English. Parking lot. American English versus car park, British English. These terms both refer to an area where vehicles are parked, but Americans use parking lot, while the British use car park. Potato chips, American English versus crisps, British English. This difference involves the terminology for thin, fried slices of potato. Americans call them potato chips, whereas the British use the term crisps. Angry, American English versus bad-humored, British English. These words have similar meanings but different forms. Americans typically use angry to describe someone who is upset or irritated, while the British may use bad-tempered or bad-humored to convey the same idea. These differences in vocabulary are just a few examples of the many variances between American and British English. Vocabulary discrepancies often arise due to historical factors, regional preferences, and the influence of other languages on each variant. It's important to note that while these words may differ, speakers of both American and British English can generally understand each other's vocabulary, and these variations often add richness and diversity to the English language. American English and British English do have some differences in how prepositions are used in certain contexts. Here are the examples highlighting the differences. American English. On the weekend. Americans commonly use on to refer to days of the week or weekends. For example, I'll see you on the weekend. On a team. In American English, on is often used to indicate membership or participation in a group or team. For instance, she plays on basketball team. Please write me soon. In American English, it's common to use write me or call me without preposition when asking someone to contact you. For example, please write me soon or call me tomorrow. British English. At the weekend. In British English, at is frequently used to refer to days of the week or weekends. For example, I'll see you at the weekend. In a team. In British English, in is more commonly used to indicate membership or participation in a group or team. For instance, she plays in football team. Please write to me soon. In British English, it's common to use write to or write to me when asking someone to contact you in writing. For example, please write to me soon. These differences in preposition usage are relatively subtle and may not always hold true in every instance, as language is fluid and subject to regional variations and individual preferences. It's essential to recognize that both American and British English are correct in their respective contexts, and speakers of each variant can generally understand the usage of prepositions in the other variant. The difference highlighted in the past simple and past participle forms of certain verbs between American English and British English is related to irregular verb conjugation. Both variants have regular verbs that follow a pattern of adding ed to form the past simple and past participle, but they also have irregular verbs where the forms differ. Here are the examples, with the American English forms first and the British English forms second. Burnt American English and burnt British English. This represents the past simple and past participle forms of the verb burn. Americans often use burned, while the British typically use burnt. Dreamed American English and dreamed British English. This is the past simple and past participle of the verb dream. Americans often use dreamed, while the British typically use dreamed. Leaned American English and leaned British English. These forms represent the past simple and past participle of the verb lean. Americans often use leaned, while the British typically use leaned. Learned American English and learned British English. This represents the past simple and past participle forms of the verb learn. Americans often use learned, while the British typically use learnt. Smelled American English and smelt British English. These forms represent the past simple and past participle of the verb smell in different variants. Americans often use smelled, while the British typically use smelt. Spelled American English and spelt British English. This represents the past simple and past participle forms of the verb spell. Americans often use spelled, while the British typically use spelt. Spilled American English and spilt British English. These forms represent the past simple and past participle of the verb spill. Americans often use spilled, while the British typically use spilt. These differences in irregular verb conjugation are common and represent a historical evolution of the language. Both forms are considered correct in their respective variants of English, and speakers from one variant can generally understand the usage of the other. The spelling differences between American English and British English are primarily due to historical and linguistic influences. Here are some common spelling variations. In American English, suffix or. In American English, words that end with a suffix or are spelled this way. For example, flavor, humor, color. Suffix eyes. In American English, words that take the suffix eyes are spelled this way. For example, recognize, patronize. In British English, suffix our. In British English, words that end with the suffix our are spelled this way. For example, flavor, humor, color. Suffix eyes. In British English, words that take the suffix eyes are spelled this way. For example, recognize, patronize. These spelling differences between American and British English can be traced back to various historical factors, including the influence of different languages on each variant and standardization efforts. While these spelling variations exist, it's essential to note that they don't affect the meaning or pronunciation of words. Both American and British English are considered standard forms of the language, and the choice of spelling typically depends on the regional or national conventions followed by writers and speakers. Additionally, modern technology and communication have somewhat blurred these distinctions, as people often encounter both spellings in various contexts.